Many years ago, I was doing a course at a university in Canada, and I was working with a wonderful teacher, Francis Gunn, Dr. Gunn, professor at Ryerson University. And we were working with Eaton's, which was a retail chain, and we were doing a course on communication. And there were two people there, wonderful people, Jim Chestnut, Tony Lamantia. They became good friends of mine. And they set up the course, and they'd done all kinds of great things for this retail chain, Eaton's. Francis and Jim and Tony and I were sitting at this table having lunch in the midst of the course. And she looked up at the two of them and she said, "You guys have probably had quite a few interesting experiences together. What are some of the things you've done?" And then that lunch was filled with all kinds of amazing stories about things they'd done around the world when they were buying things, setting things up, incredible stuff. And it was such a fascinating conversation. And all it took was one question, one good question, that opened up the whole conversation. I like to say good questions are like intellectual fireworks. They explode with all kinds of ideas. So I want to talk about four things that I think are really important for questions. And things to keep in mind when you do questioning, because I think not just coaching, but in conversation, the way you ask questions is a really, really critical thing. As Francis Gunn showed, when you ask a good question, you have a good conversation. First thing is, I think a good coaching question, in fact, a good coaching in general, gives power to the other person. And a simple question like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how close was that to your ideal is a question that isn't asking what you think my number is. I'm asking you what you think your number is. And so simply asking a question that gives control to the other person often leads to a lot more interesting information. There's a famous question in solution-focused coaching. It sounds a little goofy, but I love this question. And the question's called the miracle question. And the question is, if a miracle happened and tomorrow you woke up and this issue was resolved the way you would like it to look, what would be happening and what would be different and how would you know it's true? And I've found every time I ask that question, now sometimes I preface it by saying, this is going to sound a bit goofy, but I have this question. But every time I've asked that question, I've heard really interesting. Sometimes people pause and go, "Oh, that is a good question." But it opens things up and it gives control to the other person and it gives power to the other person. So for me, a really good question is one that gives power to the other person. Second thing is that a good question is authentic. It's a real question. It's a question where I'm genuinely asking you something because I want to know what you think. It's to say, it's not a question that's trying to take the other person to a predetermined location. So I'll give you some examples of non-real questions. If I said to my boss, "Don't you think I deserve a raise?" I'm not really asking a question. I'm really saying I deserve a raise, right? And it is a question, but it's not a question where I really want to hear their opinion. I'm a question where I'm trying to take them to a predetermined destination. If I say to the teacher, "Don't you think your lessons would be more clear if your objectives were more clear at the front?" That's not really a question. That's advice with a question mark at the end of it. So the second thing about an effective question is it is a real question. I genuinely want to hear your perspective. Michael Bungay Stanier has a simple question. What do you want? That's a real question. I'm genuinely trying to hear your perspective on the thing. The third thing is the question is respectful. What I mean is it's a question that communicates that I have belief in you. And Michael Bungay Stanier has a lot of great questions, and maybe my favorite question from him is this. "You've probably thought a lot about this. What do you think you might do?" I mean, that question communicates that the other person already has ideas. I withhold the temptation to tell them what I think they should do. I'm curious a little bit longer, is the way Michael would put it. Before I go right in to tell them what I think they should do, I step back and say, "What do you think?" And you can ask the second question, "And what else?" Supplementary question. But by starting with a positive presupposition that they've already thought about it and they've got some good ideas, I communicate respect. The opposite of that is to ask a question that's going to make the person feel small. To ask them a question that contains judgment in it. Like, why didn't you give the kids more time to practice that activity? They clearly didn't have enough time to do it. That question is not really a question. It's telling the person not only that they did it wrong, but that there's something bad about the way they do it. It contains a negative judgment. And a really good question is a respectful question, a question that communicates, I have faith in you. I see your strengths. I believe in you. The last thing is that good questions are invitational as opposed to probing. You probably heard people talk about probing questions. The thing is, I don't think I want to be probed. It doesn't sound good to me, probed. Some guy in a white coat's got some cold metal he's going to stick me with. That doesn't sound good to me. I don't want to be probed. So what's an alternative? An alternative is an invitational question. An invitational question is one that gives the person an opportunity to expand on their thinking or to see it in clear perspective. So a simple question like, what would that look like if it was really the way you wanted it to be, to get them to expand on what they think? Or a question like, well, if you were talking to somebody else in your situation, what kind of advice would you give them? That kind of question also opens things up. There's a couple other questions I really love. Susan Scott has a question. What if nothing happens? Is that okay? And she has another really great question, which is, given the time we've got today, what's the most important thing for us to talk about? John Campbell has a lot of great questions. And one of the questions I love of his is, given all these options, which one gives you the most confidence? Now, there are lots of other questions. We have lots on our website. What I would say, though, is you want to consider, as Christian van Nieuwenburg has advised me, and he wrote about it in one of his books about coaching, to create a list of favorite questions, questions you go back to, and you can use them in conversation. You can use them to move things forward. If you make a list of favorite questions, though, I would suggest you keep in mind the 4 things I mentioned. Is it an empowering question, that it gives control over the other person? Is it an authentic question, one where you're not really giving advice with a question mark at the end of it? You're really asking a question out of genuine curiosity about what the person has to say. Is it respectful? Does it come from a presupposition of goodness and knowledge and professionalism on the part of the other person? And is it invitational as opposed to probing? Keep those things in mind. You're probably going to be asking good questions.